Let's talk about what the best terrain to use for Fate is. And I realize this might be a kind of strange conversation to have because Fate isn't a game that is often associated with using a lot of terrain and miniatures and things like that. But, I think about terrain quite a bit as a storytelling game, and I do like terrain and I do like miniatures. And so I had been thinking about, well, how would we use particularly these? These are TerraTiles. How do we use these to depict terrain in Fate when you do actually want to put out something on the table with a few different miniatures, because we've all got a whole bunch of different miniatures. And so if you've got some terrain tiles, how do you incorporate that into your Fate game to help facilitate the game so that you can tell the story that you're telling and also have the advantages of being able to, let everybody look at the tabletop and see some kind of situation, the physical situation using terrain tiles and miniatures. So, if you are familiar with Fate, or if you're not familiar with Fate, either way, Fate does minimally talk about how to represent the physical situation through different kinds of sketches, through a system called zones. How do you do this? How do you depict the physical situation with zones in Fate? And so it had occurred to me that if you've got something like TerraTiles, which are discrete elements on the board, because these are the hexes, you've actually got a situation where you could represent and say, hey, that any one of these particular hexes, like this right here, is a zone. And then you've got different barriers, like this with the stream here, that could separate zones even on a single tile. And so I want to talk about that, and there isn't a whole lot of information on the zones in Fate, but I want to go ahead and open it up. This is from the core book right here. I am on page 157 when it starts to talk about zones. And it says, if your conflict takes place over a large area, you might want to break it down into zones for easier reference. And a zone is an abstract representation of physical space. And I still think that part of it is very important, the abstract representation part. The best definition of a zone is that it's close enough that you can interact directly with someone, in other words, walking up to them and punching them in the face. That right there is actually what started me thinking about TerraTiles, because if you are thinking about a particular zone, and you've got some miniatures, and I've got some right here, and because we don't want to get bogged down when we're playing Fate into individual spaces and trying to count, the number of hexes that we're moving or something like that. But you might want to have several different characters represented by miniatures in a single zone. And then you would know, hey, if they're on this particular tile, then they're in the same zone and they can interact physically with one another, as it's talking about right here in this. So it says, generally speaking, a conflict should rarely involve more than a handful of zones. 2 to 4 is probably sufficient, save for really big conflicts. This isn't a miniature board game. Zones should give a tactile sense of the environment, but at the point where you need something more than a cocktail napkin to lay it out, you're getting too complicated. And that's when I think that TerraTiles jumps in, because there's a lot of variety in all the different tiles. The Game Master can have all of these different tiles, at hand very easily. You can just lay them out, probably easier than drawing them on a cocktail napkin, and you also get the color and things like that. And often, of course, players and game masters alike do like having some of their miniatures that they have around to sit on the tiles anyway. So it says, if you can describe the area as bigger than a house, you can probably divide it into 2 or more zones, okay? And if it's separated by stairs, a ladder, a fence, or a wall, it could be divided into zones like 2 floors on a house. Above X and below X can be different zones, especially if moving between them takes some kind of doing. So here's the example right here. Amanda decides the warehouse needs to be multiple zones. The main floor is big enough in her mind for 2 zones, and the heavy crate she mentioned earlier is hard to freely move between them. And so that also means that any one of these different zones can have aspects on them. So if you've got different aspects sitting on the table, you could even tag individual zones if you're using TerraTiles for all the different zones, so you know exactly what aspects apply to them. And actually, I suppose this is a good time to point out that the new TerraTiles that will be released through GameFound will have a wet and dry erase safe coating, which means that if a zone has an aspect attached to it, you can just write directly on the tiles to indicate the aspect, and then erase it when it's no longer in play. Easy. She knows that there's also a second floor ringing the inner wall, so she makes the additional zone. She adds ladder access only to the scene. If for some reason someone decides to run outside, she figures that can be a 4th zone, but she doesn't think that needs to have any aspects for it. She sketches the rough map on an index card for everyone to see. There is some additional information on zones in Fate over here on page 169 when it talks about movement. In a conflict, it's important to track where everyone is relative to one another, and that's why I think that some miniatures on some TerraTiles would be a fantastic way to do that. It says, which is why we divide the environment where the conflict is taking place into zones. When you have zones, you have people trying to move around them in order to get to one another or at a certain objective. Normally, it's no big deal to move from one zone to another. If there's nothing preventing you from doing so, you can move one zone in addition to your action for the exchange. And I think that makes a lot of sense as far as TerraTiles goes. If you're laying them out, and I've got the stones over here are the stones, you could move from this. It doesn't matter where on this particular zone your miniature is, you just know that you can take your action and you can also move over here to an additional zone. I think that makes a lot of sense and makes things really easy and provides some color for your table. If you want to move more than one zone up to anywhere else on the map, if a situation aspect suggests that it might be difficult to move freely, or if another character is in your way, then you must make an overcome action using athletics to move. This counts as your action for the exchange. GMs. Just as with other overcome rolls, you'll set the difficulty. You might use the number of zones the character is moving, or the situation aspects in the way as justification for how high or low you set the passive opposition. If another character is impeding the path, roll active opposition, and feel free to invoke obstructing situational aspects to aid in their defense. If you fail the roll, whatever was impeding you keeps you from moving. If you tie, you get to move, but your opponent takes a temporary advantage of some kind. If you succeed, you move without consequence. If you succeed with style, you may claim a boost in addition to your movement. See, the thing that I do like about this system is that it's easy and it's abstract. So let's take a look at their example here. It says, in our continuing warehouse conflict, Serene wants to go after one of Ogg's thugs, which has started shooting arrows down from the second floor. This requires her to cross one zone to get to the access ladder for the second floor and then climb it, making her opponent 2 zones away. She is currently mixing it up with a thug herself, whose fight value is at fair, which is +2. Lily tells Amanda her intent, and Amanda says, okay, the thug you're fighting is going to try to keep you from getting away, so he's going to provide active opposition. Serene's athletics is great, +4. She rolls and gets +0 for a great result. The thug rolls his opposition and rolls a -1 for a result of average +2. That gives Serene 3 shifts and a success with style. Lily and Amanda describe Serene faking out the thug, vaulting over a crate, and taking the ladder 2 rungs at a time to get up to the top. She takes a boost, which she calls momentum. The thug at the top swallows hard, bringing her crossbow to bear. His crossbow to bear. Okay, so that is zones and movement. There is a little bit more about zones in the system toolkit right here. And so I've got that marked. It's on page 62 here, where it talks about zones. And the zone map during conflict breaks up physical space during a fight, giving characters with high athletics and physique scores the opportunity to dominate the battlefield. Here are a few ideas to make zones an exciting part of your game. Moving through zones. In games with quite a few zones, you may want characters to sacrifice their turn in order to move a number of zones equal to their athletics, or to remove a number of physical obstacles equal to their physique. So this is interesting. Now we have some type of limit on the number of zones you can move that's going to be equal to your athletics score. Fast and strong characters want to be fast and strong, but rolling dice isn't always the best way to represent that in Fate. That's why, according to this suggestion here, you just are able to move or remove obstacles according to those numbers. Tight zones can create drama. While zones divide up big areas like parking lots and stadiums, showing how difficult it is to run across a football field quickly, they can also be used to divide up small areas in interesting ways. For example, a fight on a ship might take place in tight quarters that allow allies to cross several zones in order to offer support to a friend in trouble. Dangerous zone aspects. Zones can also create drama by restricting movement and providing threats the characters have to overcome. For example, a zone on a battlefield might have the aspect taking heavy fire, requiring characters to make an athletics roll to avoid taking damage as they run through the zone. And then also some zones might disappear, it says, such as a collapsing bridge. Then we go into mental and social zones, but that's not really the purpose of what we're talking about here. We're talking about representing the physical situation in a game. So I think that if you're talking about 2 to 4 zones in a game of Fate, I think that TerraTiles happens to represent that really well on the battlefield, on your tabletop. So, for example, I don't have a lot of space here on my desk where I shoot my YouTube videos, but I was able to lay out, 6 different hexagons, which could be 6 different zones in Fate. And so I've got some different miniatures here about orc warriors, and I've got some dwarves and some elves that might be fighting them, and also a couple of different kinds of undead types. But I think this is a perfectly acceptable and reasonable amount of tiles to have several different zones. If you're in the same zone, it means that you could potentially reach out and touch somebody with a melee weapon. Maybe if you're 1 zone away or more than 1 zone away, that's where the elves with the missile weapons come into play, so they can shoot more than 1 zone. This is a really easy way to set things up and represent the physical situation to all the players, including the game master, at the table without having to get into all the fussy detail of like moving space by space and hex by hex and things like that. And the TerraTiles start to suggest some aspects that might be in play for each one of the different zones. Like this right here is completely open ground, so maybe there's no particular aspect over here. But this right here, obviously rocky terrain, so you don't have to come up with anything else. It's just represented right there on the table. So this one has the aspect rocky terrain for whatever might happen in here. This one right here, you can see the trees that are kind of represented here. So this one might be lightly wooded. Everyone can just see that this zone here is lightly wooded. If you're not going to worry about this stream as being an obstacle to movement, maybe it's not that deep, maybe it's just a rather shallow stream. But obviously, this one has the aspect shallow stream. And over here, we've got, rocky shore over here, and here we have sandy shore. So immediately, as far as a storytelling perspective goes, you lay out these TerraTiles to put out 4 or 5 different zones, and you can immediately start to represent the situation and get ideas based on what's drawn on them about what the aspects for each zone is. I like doing theater of the mind gaming. I also like doing, highly tactical square by square kinds of gaming, but actually I also really like this hybrid middle ground which Fate does have with these zones, and I really like this, where you do get to look at something on the table, you get the color, you get the zones, you get a little bit of representation of the physical situation without having to spell everything out verbally. Everybody can just look at it, but we're not worried about exactly where everybody is standing in each exact zone. You know that if you're in here, you're able to make a melee attack. I really like this type of approach, especially when you're focused on more storytelling type of games. I think that this hybrid approach, this zone approach, which works very well with TerraTiles, happens to be a great middle ground between completely theater of the mind and also the highly tactical grid-based games. So if you want some TerraTiles for your table, I'm re-releasing them through GameFound. I'll put the link down below, so go over there, follow the project. I think we have over 900 people now following TerraTiles on the GameFound page, which is fantastic. So I've got all the additional information about what's in each particular set and everything else about TerraTiles on that page. And also, please check out my YouTube channel. I've got a lot of other videos on fantasy and tabletop gaming and all of that. It's all organized by playlist, so find the topic that you're interested in and then just click that and enjoy some videos. I look forward to seeing you for many more to come, and I will see you in another video. Until then, happy gaming.